Introduction to Metaphysics by Martin Heidegger quotes. Introduction to Metaphysics by Martin Heidegger is an exploration of the foundational question, why are there beings at all instead of nothing? Originally delivered as lectures in 1935, this work addresses the meaning of being in a rapidly modernizing world and examines the spiritual and philosophical decline Heidegger perceives in Western civilization. He delves into how the Greek concept of physis, the emerging, enduring sway of beings, has been historically narrowed, transforming profound existential queries into overly simplistic metaphysical definitions. Through these reflections, Heidegger critiques the limitations imposed by science, logic, and superficial thinking, urging a return to a more profound engagement with being. His work here is both a philosophical challenge to contemporary metaphysics and a call for a deeper, historically rooted questioning that restores authentic spiritual engagement with existence. Quote 1. Why are there beings at all instead of nothing? That is the question. Presumably, it is no arbitrary question. This quote introduces the fundamental metaphysical question that serves as the core of Heidegger's exploration. He suggests that it is not merely a superficial or random inquiry, but the most significant one. The question is positioned as the primary one in philosophical investigation, transcending all other inquiries by questioning the existence of beings themselves rather than individual instances of existence. Quote 2. The question is the broadest in scope. It comes to a halt at no being of any kind whatsoever. The question embraces all that is, and that means not only what is now present at hand in the broadest sense, but also what has previously been and what will be in the future. This explains the breadth of the question, highlighting that it addresses all of existence, past, present, and future. Heidegger emphasizes that the question encompasses everything that exists, and in doing so, it also touches upon the concept of nothing, which lies beyond the limits of beings. Quote 3. Just as it is the broadest question, the question is also the deepest. Why are there beings at all? Why? That is, what is the ground? From what ground do beings come? On what ground do beings stand? Heidegger describes the depth of the question by focusing on its inquiry into the ground, or foundation of beings. He is not merely asking what beings are, but probing into why they exist in the first place, seeking the fundamental reason or ground for their existence. Quote 4. Finally, as the broadest and deepest question, it is also the most originary. What do we mean by that? If we consider our question in the whole breadth of what it puts into question, beings as such and as a whole, then it strikes us right away that in the question, we keep ourselves completely removed from every particular individual being as precisely this or that being. Here, Heidegger elaborates on the originary nature of the question, stating that it abstracts from individual beings and considers existence as a whole. This indicates that the question goes beyond specific entities, making it more fundamental than any other inquiry, addressing the very existence of all beings rather than focusing on one in particular. Quote 5. The asking of this question is not, in relation to beings as such and as a whole, some arbitrary occurrence amid beings, such as the falling of raindrops. The why question challenges beings as a whole, so to speak, outstrips them, though never completely. Heidegger suggests that this metaphysical questioning is not a random or isolated event, but a profound challenge to the existence of all beings. It transcends the everyday occurrences of existence while still being rooted in the nature of being itself, demonstrating the tension between the question and the entities it interrogates. Quote 6. Philosophy, for originally Christian faith, is foolishness. Philosophizing means asking, why are there beings at all instead of nothing? In this quote, Heidegger contrasts the approach of Christian faith with philosophy. He indicates that while faith might provide an answer, The act of philosophizing involves questioning this answer and seeking deeper understanding. For faith, such questioning may seem unnecessary or even foolish, but for philosophy, it is essential. Quote 7. Philosophy is essentially untimely, because it is one of those few things whose fate it remains never to be able to find a direct resonance in their own time, and never to be permitted to find such a resonance. Heidegger here highlights the timeless nature of philosophy. He asserts that philosophy does not conform to the trends or needs of its time, but stands apart, often misunderstood or overlooked in the present, only to find significance or relevance later, underscoring its independent and enduring nature. Quote 8. But, according to its essence, philosophy never makes things easier, but only more difficult. This quote captures the essence of Heidegger's view on philosophy. Rather than simplifying or providing clear answers, philosophy complicates things by opening up deeper questions. It burdens us with the weight of existence and the task of understanding being itself, making it an inherently challenging pursuit. Quote 9. Philosophizing, we can now say, is extraordinary questioning about the extraordinary. Heidegger describes philosophy as a mode of inquiry that goes beyond the ordinary or everyday. To philosophize is to voluntarily venture into a realm that is unfamiliar and challenging, where one questions not just surface-level phenomena, but delves into deeper, more fundamental issues. This form of questioning is set apart from practical or necessary concerns and is rooted in a radical freedom of thought. Quote 10. But with this Latin translation, the originary content of the Greek word phusis is already thrust aside. The authentic philosophical naming force of the Greek word is destroyed. Heidegger criticizes the translation of the Greek word phusis into the Latin natura, arguing that this translation distorts the original philosophical meaning. Phusis, in Greek, denotes the natural process of emerging and unfolding, a fundamental concept in early Greek thought, which is reduced in meaning when translated into Latin. This linguistic shift, Heidegger contends, marks the beginning of the loss of the true essence of early Greek philosophy. Quote 11. In the word, in language, things first come to be and are. This quote emphasizes Heidegger's view that language is not merely a tool for communication, but is fundamental to the way things are understood and come into existence. For Heidegger, language shapes reality by allowing beings to reveal themselves. Therefore, misuse of language, as in idle talk or slogans, can sever our genuine connection with reality, preventing true understanding. Quote 12. Phusis is being itself, by virtue of which beings first become and remain observable. Heidegger equates phusis with being itself, suggesting that it is through this process of emergence that beings come into existence and are sustained. It is not just a natural phenomenon, but the fundamental ground of all existence, allowing beings to appear and be observed. Heidegger thus links the concept of phusis to the broader philosophical inquiry into the nature of being. Quote 13. Only the small begins small, the small whose dubious greatness consists in diminishing everything. What is small is the inception of decline, which can then also become great in the sense of the enormity of total annihilation. Here, Heidegger contrasts the concept of greatness with that of smallness, suggesting that what is truly great begins great and sustains itself through greatness. In contrast, what begins small signals the start of decline, which may grow large but only in terms of destruction or annihilation. This reflects Heidegger's belief in the grandeur of Greek philosophy, which began with great concepts that have since diminished in modern thought. Quote 14. Philosophical questioning about beings as such is metaphysical. It questions on beyond beings. It is metaphysics. Heidegger explains the origin of the term metaphysics, which in Greek means to go beyond the physical or natural world, metaphysica. This type of questioning transcends the empirical or material aspects of existence and seeks to understand the fundamental nature of being itself. Metaphysics, then, is the philosophical pursuit of knowledge about what lies beyond the observable world. Quote 15. Whoever wills, whoever lays his whole Dasein into a will, is resolute. Resoluteness delays nothing, does not shirk, but acts from the moment and without fail. Heidegger here discusses the nature of will and resoluteness, stating that true will involves a firm commitment that does not waver or hesitate. To be resolute means to fully engage one's being, Dasein, in the present moment, taking decisive action without hesitation. This resoluteness is not simply about decision-making, but is a deep existential stance that shapes one's relationship with being. Quote 16. Truth is the openness of beings. To know is accordingly to be able to stand in the openness of beings, to stand up to it. In this quote, Heidegger defines truth as the state in which beings reveal themselves in their full openness. To know something is not merely to have information, but to be able to confront and stand within this openness, to engage with the reality of beings as they are. This understanding of truth emphasizes an active participatory role in knowledge, where one must be open to the full experience of being. Quote 17. Being able to learn presupposes being able to question. Questioning is the willing to know that we discussed earlier, the open resoluteness to be able to stand in the openness of beings. Heidegger links learning to questioning, suggesting that the ability to learn fundamentally depends on the ability to ask questions. True questioning is a form of willing that is directed toward understanding, involving an open and resolute engagement with beings. This kind of questioning requires a readiness to confront the unknown and to be open to what beings may reveal. Quote 18. Philosophy stands in a completely different domain and rank of spiritual Dasein. Only poetry is of the same order as philosophical thinking, although thinking and poetry are not identical. Heidegger emphasizes that philosophy occupies a unique and higher realm of spiritual existence, distinct from science. While poetry is on a similar level, both philosophy and poetry deal with deeper existential truths that go beyond everyday understanding. This suggests that these two modes of expression engage with existence in a way that makes beings and being newly present, allowing for a fresh encounter with the world. Quote 19. True talk of nothing always remains unfamiliar. It does not allow itself to be made common. This quote highlights the elusive nature of nothing in philosophical discourse. Heidegger stresses that speaking about nothing is not something that can be easily understood or domesticated by logic or common sense. Instead, it retains a sense of unfamiliarity and mystery, challenging ordinary ways of thinking. This unfamiliarity is a critical aspect of genuine philosophical inquiry. Quote 20. Beings are now no longer what just happens to be present at hand. They begin to waver, regardless of whether we know beings with all certainty, regardless of whether we grasp them in their full scope or not. Heidegger here points out that when we question why beings exist instead of nothing, we encounter a fundamental uncertainty about their nature. Beings lose their self-evidence and become something that is no longer stable or fixed. This wavering of beings represents a shift in our understanding, where the certainty of being is disrupted by the possibility of not being. Quote 21. Our Dasein too, as it questions, comes into suspense, and nevertheless maintains itself by itself in this suspense. In this passage, Heidegger explains that when we engage in fundamental questioning, such as asking why there are beings instead of nothing, we ourselves are thrown into a state of uncertainty or suspense. However, despite this state of uncertainty, our existence, Dasein, manages to maintain itself within that tension. This reveals the essential nature of Dasein as being able to confront existential uncertainty. Quote 22. What if the fault is not our own, we of today, nor that of our immediate or most distant forebears, but rather is based in a happening that runs through Western history from the inception onward, a happening that the eyes of all historians will never reach, but which nevertheless happens, formerly, today, and in the future. Heidegger suggests that the philosophical and existential crisis we face is not a recent development, but a deeper historical condition that has shaped Western thought from its beginnings. This ongoing happening is not something that historians can easily trace, yet it profoundly affects our relationship with being. Heidegger implies that understanding this historical happening is crucial for grasping the nature of our current spiritual crisis. Quote 23. To ask, how does it stand with being? This means nothing less than to repeat and retrieve the inception of our historical spiritual Dasein, in order to transform it into the other inception. Here, Heidegger asserts that to inquire into the nature of being is to return to the original beginnings of Western existence and thought. However, this return is not a simple repetition of the past, but a transformative act that seeks to begin anew, embracing the uncertainty and strangeness of a new inception. This transformation requires a fundamental rethinking of our relationship with being, allowing for a renewal of historical and spiritual possibilities. Quote 24. The question, how does it stand with being, is included as a prior question in our guiding question, why are there beings at all instead of nothing? Heidegger concludes that the question of being is inherently tied to the more fundamental question of why beings exist at all. Before we can address the existence of beings, we must first confront the nature of being itself. This prior question about being forms the foundation of all metaphysical inquiry, and must be understood before any further exploration of existence can take place. Quote 25. But we have fallen out of what this word is saying, and for now cannot find our way back. It is on these grounds, and on no others, that the word being no longer applies to anything. Heidegger suggests that we have lost our connection to the true meaning of being. The word has become empty, and no longer resonates with the depth of understanding it once held. This loss of connection has left us unable to grasp the significance of the concept, and as a result, being has become a mere word, with no real application to our existence. Quote 26. For every normally thinking human being, and we all want to be normal, such trains of thought are immediately and entirely convincing. In this quote, Heidegger is critiquing the conventional thinking that dismisses the complexity of the concept of being. He highlights how most people settle for simple explanations, content with being normal, and not pushing the boundaries of their understanding. This normality, however, leads to a superficial grasp of profound philosophical questions, stifling deeper inquiry. Quote 27. The point is to restore the historical Dasein of human beings, and this also always means our own most future Dasein, in the whole of the history that is allotted to us, back to the power of being that is to be opened up originally. Heidegger emphasizes the need to reconnect human existence, Dasein, with the true power of being. He sees this as a historical task that spans both our past and future, urging us to recover the original meaning and significance of being. This restoration is crucial for understanding our place in history and the unfolding of existence. Quote 28. The asking of this prior question, and thereby the asking of the fundamental question of metaphysics, is a historical questioning through and through. Here, Heidegger argues that the question of being is inherently tied to history. It is not merely a philosophical or abstract inquiry, but one that involves the entire historical existence of human beings. The process of asking this question engages with the unfolding of history, and is essential for understanding the human condition within its historical context. Quote 29. Our asking of the fundamental metaphysical question is historical because it opens up the happening of human Dasein in its essential relations, that is, its relations to beings as such and as a whole. Heidegger further clarifies that the fundamental question of metaphysics is historical because it reveals the essential relationships between human existence, Dasein, and beings. This questioning allows us to explore the broader connections between our existence and the totality of beings, leading to a deeper understanding of our role in the unfolding of history. Quote 30. The darkening of the world contains within itself a disempowering of the spirit, its dissolution, diminution, suppression, and misinterpretation. Heidegger speaks of a darkening that is affecting the world, particularly a loss of spiritual power and meaning. This darkening results in the weakening and misinterpretation of the spirit, leading to a diminished understanding of deeper truths. He sees this as a critical problem in modern times, where spiritual and philosophical insights are being eroded. Quote 31. Spirit is originally attuned, knowing resolution to the essence of being. Heidegger defines spirit as the capacity to engage deeply with the essence of being. True spirit is not simply intelligence or cleverness, but a profound understanding and resolution toward what being truly is. This alignment with being allows spirit to act as a guiding force in understanding existence. Quote 32. The question about being will be most intimately intertwined with the question about language for us. In this quote, Heidegger connects the inquiry into being with the nature of language. He argues that the way we use and understand language is deeply tied to our understanding of being. If our relationship to being has been lost, it affects our language as well, making it difficult to articulate and comprehend deeper truths. This makes the recovery of language crucial for reconnecting with being. Quote 33. But we have to revolutionize the teachers, and for this, the university first has to transform itself and come to grips with its task, instead of puffing itself up with irrelevancies. Heidegger stresses the need for fundamental reform in education, particularly in how teachers are prepared. He argues that universities should not focus on superficial achievements or irrelevant matters, but should transform their approach to align more closely with their essential tasks. This transformation is necessary to create a more profound relationship with language and knowledge, which can only happen if teachers themselves undergo a revolution in their understanding and approach to education. Quote 34. Essence and being speak in language. Heidegger asserts that language is not merely a tool for communication, but is intrinsically linked to the concepts of essence and being. Language reveals and articulates the essence of things, allowing being to come into presence. This statement underscores the deep connection between thought, language, and existence, suggesting that language plays a fundamental role in how we understand and engage with the world. Quote 35. The polemos named here is a strife that holds sway before everything divine and human, not war in the human sense. In this quote, Heidegger clarifies that Heraclitus's use of the term polemos refers to an essential creative struggle that brings things into being, rather than a mere human conflict. This struggle is fundamental to the unfolding of existence, as it generates the differences and oppositions that allow beings to emerge and establish themselves. It is through this strife that the world and order are created, giving rise to the dynamic structure of reality. Quote 36. Beings as such now first come into being. This becoming a world is authentic history. Heidegger describes the process by which beings come into presence and form a world as the true unfolding of history. For him, history is not merely a chronological sequence of events, but the authentic emergence of beings and the creation of a world. This process is grounded in the interplay of forces and struggle, which allows beings to assert themselves and the world to take shape. Quote 37. For the Greeks, being says constancy in a twofold sense. 1. Standing in itself as arising and standing forth, phusis. 2. But, as such, constantly, that is, enduringly, abiding, ousia. Here, Heidegger explains the Greek conception of being, which involves both the act of coming into presence, phusis, and the enduring nature of that presence, ousia. This dual understanding of being as both dynamic emergence and stable persistence reflects the complexity of existence as conceived by the Greeks. For them, being is not static, but involves an ongoing process of revealing and sustaining itself. Quote 38. The thoughtlessness and vapidity with which one uses the words existence and to exist as designations for being offer fresh evidence of our alienation from being. Heidegger criticizes the modern use of terms like existence and to exist, suggesting that they have lost their depth and meaning. He believes that this casual usage reflects a deeper alienation from the true understanding of being. By treating these concepts superficially, we lose sight of the profound philosophical significance that they once held, further distancing ourselves from an authentic engagement with existence. Quote 39. Ptosis and enklesis mean to fall, to incline, that is, nothing other than to depart from the constancy of the stand, and thus to deviate from it. Heidegger draws attention to the Greek linguistic terms ptosis and enklesis, which refer to a departure from an upright, constant stance. He relates this to the Greek understanding of being, where standing firm and maintaining presence are key aspects of existence. The use of these terms in language study reflects the Greeks' broader conception of being, where deviation from constancy is seen as a significant movement in both language and existence. Quote 40. If for us being is just an empty word and an evanescent meaning, then we must at least try to grasp fully this last remnant of a connection. Heidegger acknowledges that the concept of being has become hollow and almost meaningless in modern language. However, he argues that instead of dismissing it, we should strive to understand what remains of its meaning. This effort is necessary to reconnect with the deeper philosophical implications of being, even if only through the fragile remnants left in language. Quote 41. What is really at issue is an essential clarification of the essence of being as regards its essential involvement with the essence of language. Heidegger emphasizes that the exploration of the word being is not merely a linguistic exercise, but a crucial philosophical task. The connection between being and language is fundamental, and clarifying this relationship is necessary to understand the deeper essence of existence. For Heidegger, language is the medium through which being reveals itself, making this investigation a key to uncovering the nature of reality. Quote 42. For the Greeks, being fundamentally means presence. Heidegger explains that the ancient Greek conception of being is closely tied to the idea of presence, something that stands forth and reveals itself in the world. This understanding is more dynamic and immediate than later interpretations of being, which tend to reduce it to a static or abstract concept. The Greek notion of being involves an ongoing process of emergence and presence in the world. Quote 43. The substantive being implies that what is so named itself is. Being now itself becomes something that is, whereas obviously only beings are, and it is not the case that being also is. In this quote, Heidegger points out the confusion that arises when we treat being as a noun or object, as if it were a thing like other beings. He clarifies that being is not an entity among other entities, but the condition that allows entities to exist. Treating being as a substantive leads to a misunderstanding of its true nature, which is more fundamental than any individual being. Quote 44. Can it still be any wonder to us now that being is so empty a word when the word form itself is based on an emptying of meaning and the apparent fixation of this emptiness? Heidegger reflects on the fact that the word being has become devoid of meaning. He suggests that this emptiness is a result of the grammatical form of the word, which abstracts and distances it from its original dynamic meaning. This process of abstraction has led to a fixation on an empty concept, stripping being of its true significance. Quote 45. The third stem appears only in the inflection of the German verb sein. Wes, Sanskrit, vasami, Germanic, wesan, to dwell, to abide, to sojourn. Here, Heidegger traces the etymology of the word being to its linguistic roots. He notes that one of the stems of the verb to be in German and other languages refers to dwelling or abiding. This etymological insight ties the concept of being to the idea of dwelling or existing in a place, emphasizing the connection between being and presence in the world. Quote 46. The word becomes a name for something indefinite. Heidegger points out that the word being, through its grammatical evolution, has lost its specific meaning and become a vague, indefinite term. This abstraction makes it difficult to grasp the true essence of being, as the word no longer points to something concrete or understandable. The blurring of its meaning reflects a broader philosophical issue in our understanding of existence. Quote 47. The etymological examination of the meaning of the word had this result. What we today, and for a long time previously, have called by the name being is, as regards its meaning, a blending that levels off three different stem meanings. Heidegger concludes that the modern understanding of the word being is the result of a blending of different linguistic roots, each with its own distinct meaning. This blending has obscured the original significance of the word, leading to its current state of vagueness and abstraction. By tracing the etymology, Heidegger reveals the complexity behind the term and suggests that its meaning has been diluted over time. Quote 48. We want to establish a position regarding this fact itself. We want this, even at the risk that our will to do so may create the appearance of stubbornness, and may seem to be an unworldly befuddlement that mistakes what is peripheral and unreal for something real, and gets obsessed with dissecting mere words. Heidegger expresses a determination to thoroughly investigate the concept of being, despite the risk of seeming stubborn or disconnected from reality. This commitment to understanding being, even if it seems like an obsession with words, highlights the seriousness of the inquiry. Heidegger's approach seeks to move beyond superficial considerations of the word being and toward a deeper philosophical understanding. Quote 49. The word being is thus indefinite in its meaning, and nevertheless we understand it definitely. Being proves to be extremely definite and completely indefinite. Heidegger identifies a paradox in the way we understand the word being. While the word seems vague and indefinite, we nevertheless use it with a clear sense of what it means. This contradiction lies at the heart of Heidegger's inquiry, as he attempts to reconcile the apparent vagueness of being with our definite understanding of it. This paradox becomes the foundation for further philosophical exploration. Quote 50. Being, that which pertains to every being whatsoever, and thus disperses itself into what is most commonplace, is the most unique of all. Heidegger points out that although being applies universally to all beings and appears to be common, it is actually the most unique and singular concept. Unlike individual beings, which can be compared and categorized, being has no counterpart and cannot be compared to anything else. This uniqueness sets being apart from all other concepts and emphasizes its foundational importance in philosophy. Quote 51. Let us not be lured away into the emptiest of forms, the verbal substantive, and let us not entangle ourselves in the abstraction of the infinitive to be. Heidegger warns against reducing the concept of being to its grammatical forms, such as the infinitive to be or the verbal substantive. These forms, while useful in language, risk abstracting and emptying the meaning of being. Heidegger urges a deeper exploration that moves beyond these linguistic structures to uncover the true essence of being, which cannot be fully captured by grammatical conventions. Quote 52. We distinguish between their being thus and being otherwise. We judge about being and not being. We therefore know unambiguously what being means. Heidegger reflects on how we constantly make distinctions between different ways of being, and even between being and not being. This everyday activity implies that we have a clear, if implicit, understanding of what being means. Despite the apparent vagueness of the term, we use it with certainty in our judgments, showing that the concept of being is more definite in practice than it might seem. Quote 53. That we understand, being is not just actual, it is also necessary. Without such an opening up of being, we could not be human in the first place. Here, Heidegger argues that understanding being is essential to human existence. It is not merely a fact that we understand being, but a necessity for us to be human. This understanding allows us to relate to the world and to other beings, forming the basis of our existence. Without it, we could not function as human beings, emphasizing the central role of being in our lives. Quote 54. The understanding of being, despite all its rank, is dark, confused, covered over and concealed. It must be illuminated, disentangled, and ripped away from concealment. Heidegger acknowledges that although we possess an understanding of being, this understanding is often obscured and unclear. To fully grasp the essence of being, we must work to clarify and bring it out of its concealed state. This process of illumination is necessary to achieve a true understanding of being, which requires deep questioning and philosophical inquiry. Quote 55. We question all the more genuinely, the more immediately and directly we hold on to what is most worthy of questioning, namely, that for us being is what we understand in a completely indefinite and yet supremely definite way. Heidegger emphasizes that the question of being is the most important question we can ask because it involves something we understand in both a definite and indefinite way. The paradox of being's meaning makes it the most worthy subject of philosophical inquiry. Heidegger encourages a direct engagement with this question, as it lies at the heart of our understanding of existence. Quote 56. But if human beings stand in Dasein, then one necessary condition for our ability to be here is this, that we understand being. Heidegger asserts that, in order for human beings to truly exist, or stand in their Dasein, being there, they must possess an understanding of being. This understanding is not just incidental, but is a fundamental condition for human existence. Without it, our ability to experience and engage with the world would be impossible, making the concept of being essential to what it means to be human. Quote 57. Is being merely an empty word? Or are being and the asking of the question of being the fate of the spiritual history of the West? Here, Heidegger frames the inquiry into being as a pivotal question for Western spiritual history. He presents two possibilities. Either being is a hollow, meaningless term, or it is deeply tied to the fate and unfolding of Western thought. This question challenges whether the concept of being holds essential significance or if it is simply an abstraction with no real impact on human history. Quote 58. Being necessarily opens itself up in our understanding. Heidegger emphasizes that the concept of being is not something abstract or distant, but something that naturally reveals itself in human understanding. It is not a concept we need to forcefully grasp. Rather, it presents itself to us as we engage with the world. This inherent openness of being suggests that understanding it is a part of our natural cognitive and existential processes. Quote 59. The word and its meaning are bound more originally to what is meant by them, but also vice versa. Being itself relies on the word in a totally different and more essential sense than any being does. Heidegger notes that the relationship between the word being and its meaning is unique compared to other words and their meanings. Being relies on language in a profound way that is different from how other things in the world do. This indicates that the concept of being is intertwined with language, and understanding being cannot be separated from the act of saying or speaking it. Quote 60. The is evinces, in its saying, a rich manifoldness of meanings. Heidegger observes that the word is carries multiple meanings, depending on its context, and yet all these meanings relate back to the concept of being. This richness of meaning shows that being is not a singular, static concept, but one that is expressed in various ways through different uses of the word is. This diversity in meaning is an important part of how we understand being. Quote 61. We always say the is in one of these meanings, although neither before nor after this saying do we carry out a special interpretation of the is, much less meditate on being. Heidegger highlights that, in everyday language, we use the word is with specific meanings without consciously reflecting on what it signifies. This unconscious use of the word indicates that our understanding of being is embedded in our language and actions, even when we are not explicitly thinking about it. This observation underscores the way being is integrated into our daily life. Quote 62. At one blow, our search for the definiteness of the meaning of the word being thus becomes explicitly what it is, a meditation on the provenance of our concealed history. Heidegger reveals that the search for the meaning of being is not just a linguistic or philosophical exercise, but a reflection on the hidden history that shapes human understanding. The way we think about being is deeply rooted in historical traditions, and uncovering this meaning requires an exploration of that history. This reflection on the past helps to clarify the present understanding of being. Quote 63. The question, how does it stand with being, must maintain itself within the history of being, if it is, in turn, to unfold and preserve its own historical import. Heidegger argues that the question of being cannot be separated from the historical context in which it has developed. To fully grasp the essence of being, we must consider how it has been understood throughout history. The inquiry into being, therefore, is not just about the present moment, but about engaging with the broader historical narrative that has shaped our understanding of existence. Quote 64. When we say being, we are driven, almost as if under compulsion, to say being and. The and does not simply mean that we incidentally attach and adjoin something additional, but rather that we speak of something from which being is distinguished. Being and not. But at the same time, we mean, in these formulaic titles, something more that somehow properly belongs to being as something distinguished from it, if only as its other. Heidegger points out that when we speak of being, we are naturally compelled to contrast it with something else, usually framed as being and something. This indicates that being is often defined in relation to something that it is not. These distinctions, such as being and becoming, or being and thinking, are not random additions, but essential to understanding being. The contrasts help clarify what being is by distinguishing it from what it is not, and this other plays a role in shaping the concept of being itself. Quote 65. More and more, it now proves itself to be a concealed ground of our historical Dasein. It will remain this even and precisely when, self-satisfied and busy with all kinds of things, we wander around over this ground as over a thinly covered abyss. Heidegger suggests that the question of being forms the hidden foundation of our existence, Dasein, though we may ignore or overlook it as we go about our everyday lives. He compares this ignorance to wandering over a barely concealed abyss, implying that the ground of our existence is fragile and not fully understood. The concealed nature of being means that it is always present as a fundamental aspect of human existence, even when we fail to recognize it. Quote 66. Being is delimited against an other, and thus already has a determinateness in this setting of a limit. Heidegger argues that being is always defined in relation to something other than itself, which gives it a certain determinateness. By setting a limit or a boundary between being and its other, we clarify the nature of being. This boundary is not arbitrary, but necessary for understanding being in its full meaning, as the contrast with its other helps to define its characteristics. Quote 67. The distinctions have not remained dominant only within Western philosophy. They pervade all knowing, acting, and speaking, even when they are not expressed explicitly or in these words. Heidegger emphasizes that the distinctions between being and its other, such as being and becoming or being and seeming, are not confined to philosophical discussions. These distinctions influence all aspects of human life, including how we think, act, and speak, even when they are not explicitly articulated. This demonstrates the profound impact these philosophical distinctions have on everyday human understanding and behavior. Quote 68. The third distinction, being and thinking, which was foreshadowed in the inception no less than the first two, unfolds definitively in the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, but first takes on its real form at the beginning of modernity. Heidegger notes that the distinction between being and thinking has ancient roots in Greek philosophy, particularly in the works of Plato and Aristotle. However, it did not fully develop until the beginning of modernity, where it became a central concern in philosophical thought. This distinction, which separates existence from thought, plays a significant role in modern philosophy and reflects a deep, ongoing tension in understanding the nature of reality. Quote 69. Asking the question of being in an originary way, in a way that grasps the task of unfolding the truth of the essence of being, means facing the decision regarding the concealed powers in these distinctions, and it means bringing them back to their own truth. Heidegger suggests that truly questioning the essence of being involves confronting the hidden forces that have shaped the distinctions between being and its other. By doing so, we are tasked with uncovering the truth behind these distinctions, revealing their original significance. This process of bringing these distinctions back to their truth is essential for a deeper understanding of being and its place in human existence. Quote 70. What becomes is not yet. What is no longer needs to become. That which is has left all becoming behind it, if indeed it ever became or could become. Heidegger explains the distinction between being and becoming. What exists in the present, being, no longer participates in the process of becoming because it has already completed its formation. The concept of becoming involves a process of change or development, but being, once fully realized, stands outside of this process, having left behind any need for further development or transformation. Quote 71. Being indicates itself to this saying as the proper self-collected perdurance of the constant, undisturbed by restlessness and change. In this passage, Heidegger describes being as a state of continuity and constancy, untouched by the fluctuations of change and unrest. It refers to something that endures and remains stable, self-contained, and unaffected by external influences. This depiction of being highlights its permanence and immutability, as opposed to the transient nature of becoming. Quote 72. Heraclitus, to whom one ascribes the doctrine of becoming, in stark contrast to Parmenides, in truth says the same as Parmenides. He would not be one of the greatest of the great Greeks if he said anything else. Heidegger challenges the common interpretation of Heraclitus and Parmenides as opposites, suggesting that they were fundamentally aligned in their philosophical understandings of being. While Heraclitus is often associated with the idea of constant change, becoming, and Parmenides with the unchanging nature of being, Heidegger asserts that their philosophies ultimately point to the same deeper truth about existence. Quote 73. This division is just as ancient as the first. The fact that these two divisions, being and becoming, being and seeming, are equally originary points to a deeper relation, one that remains obscure to this very day. Heidegger notes that the distinction between being and seeming is as ancient as the distinction between being and becoming. He suggests that these two divisions are closely related, though their full relationship remains unclear. This ambiguity invites further exploration into how these distinctions shape our understanding of existence and reality. Quote 74. At first, the distinction appears clear. Being as opposed to seeming means what is actual, as distinguished from, and opposed to what is not actual, the genuine versus the ungenuine. Heidegger reflects on the apparent clarity of the distinction between being and seeming, which is traditionally understood as a contrast between the real and the unreal, or the genuine and the false. This opposition suggests that being is associated with authenticity and actuality, while seeming involves illusion or misrepresentation. However, Heidegger implies that this distinction may be more complex than it initially appears. Quote 75. For us, who are exposed to the modern epistemological misinterpretation, this is not easy. For us, who can respond to the simplicity of the essential only with difficulty, and then, for the most part, emptily. Heidegger comments on the difficulty modern people face in grasping the essential simplicity of ancient distinctions like being and seeming. He argues that contemporary thought, influenced by modern epistemology, has complicated our ability to understand these concepts in their original, straightforward form. As a result, we struggle to engage with the essential truths that the ancients perceived with greater clarity. Quote 76. The essence of seeming lies in appearing. It is self-showing, self-setting forth, standing by, and lying at hand. Heidegger explains that seeming, or appearance, is not separate from being, but is a fundamental part of it. To seem is to show oneself, to be present, and to stand in relation to others. This self-revelation is inherent to being, making seeming an essential aspect of how things come into presence and are perceived. Rather than being mere illusion, seeming is intertwined with the way being manifests itself. Quote 77. Being essentially unfolds as physis. The emerging sway is an appearing. As such, it makes manifest. This already implies that being, appearing, is a letting step forth from concealment. Heidegger describes being as physis, or nature, which reveals itself by emerging and becoming manifest. This process of appearing involves stepping forth from a hidden state into unconcealment. In this sense, being is not static, but is constantly in a state of revealing itself, moving from concealment to presence. This dynamic nature of being emphasizes its connection to appearance and manifestation. Quote 78. The Greeks could say, "Beings as beings are true. The true as such is in being." This says that what shows itself in its sway stands in the unconcealed. Heidegger reflects on the Greek understanding of truth, or aletheia, as unconcealment. For the Greeks, something is true when it reveals itself as it is, standing openly in the light of being. Truth, then, is not merely about correctness or correspondence, but about the process of revealing and making manifest. In this view, truth is inherently linked to being, as both involve the movement from hiddenness to openness. Quote 79. Glory, for the Greeks, is not something additional that someone may or may not receive. It is the highest manner of being. Heidegger explains that for the Greeks, glory, doxa, is not a superficial or optional trait, but represents the highest expression of being. Glory involves standing in the light and being seen in a way that reveals one's true essence. It is a form of recognition that reflects the inherent value and greatness of a person or thing. In this sense, glory is intimately connected to the nature of being itself. Quote 80. Being means appearing. Appearing does not mean something derivative, which from time to time meets up with being. Being essentially unfolds as appearing. Heidegger asserts that being and appearing are not separate or secondary to each other. Rather, being inherently involves appearing. To be is to appear, to show oneself. This essential connection means that being is always in the process of revealing itself through appearance, and appearance is not a superficial layer, but a core aspect of what it means to be. Quote 81. Because being, physis, consists in appearing, in the offering of a look and of views, it stands essentially, and thus necessarily and constantly, in the possibility of a look that precisely covers over and conceals what beings are in truth. Heidegger explains that since being involves appearing, it is always subject to the possibility of being misunderstood or misrepresented. The way something appears might not fully reveal its true essence, and in this sense, appearance can sometimes conceal as much as it reveals. This interplay between appearance and concealment is a fundamental aspect of how we engage with and understand being. Quote 82. Only by undergoing the struggle between being and seeming did they wrest being forth from beings, did they bring beings into constancy and unconcealment. Heidegger highlights the importance of the ancient Greek struggle between being and seeming. This struggle, rather than being a mere philosophical exercise, was a necessary process by which the Greeks brought being into clarity and stability. Through this tension, they were able to unveil and establish the true nature of beings, moving from hiddenness to openness, from seeming to being. Quote 83. Oedipus goes to unveil what is concealed. In doing so, he must, step by step, place himself into an unconcealment that in the end he can endure only by gouging out his own eyes. Heidegger uses the story of Oedipus to illustrate the painful and often destructive journey toward uncovering the truth of being. Oedipus, in seeking to reveal what is hidden, eventually confronts a reality so unbearable that he blinds himself to escape it. This symbolizes the profound struggle involved in bringing what is concealed into the light of truth, a struggle that can lead to personal devastation. Quote 84. The concealed will to transform beings for the openness of Dasein calls for more. In order to bring about a change in science, and this first means bringing about a change in originary knowing, our Dasein needs an entirely different metaphysical depth. Heidegger argues that modern science, as it serves society, lacks the depth necessary for true transformation. He suggests that what is needed is a deeper, more foundational metaphysical understanding of Dasein, human existence. This change involves moving beyond superficial interpretations and developing a more profound connection to being, which in turn would bring about a real transformation in knowledge and science. Quote 85. Seeming happens in and with beings themselves. But seeming not only lets beings appear as what they really are not, it not only distorts the beings whose seeming it is. In all this, it also covers itself over as seeming, inasmuch as it shows itself as being. Heidegger explains that seeming, or appearance, is not simply an external distortion, but is an inherent aspect of beings. Seeming allows beings to present themselves sometimes as something they are not, but it also hides its own nature as seeming by presenting itself as reality. This capacity for deception is part of seeming, which creates a complex relationship between appearance and reality. Quote 86. The space, so to speak, that opens itself up in the interlocking of being, unconcealment, and seeming, I understand as errancy. Heidegger introduces the concept of errancy to describe the space created by the interplay between being, unconcealment, truth, and seeming. This space allows for the possibility of deception, mistakes, and misunderstanding. Errancy is a natural part of human existence as we navigate the complexities of appearance and reality, truth and illusion. It is within this space that beings reveal themselves, but also where confusion and error can arise. Quote 87. Being and seeming belong together, and as belonging together are constantly by one another. And in this by one another, they also always proffer change from one to the other, and hence constant confusion, and hence the possibility of aberration and mistakes. Heidegger highlights the inseparable relationship between being and seeming. They are always intertwined, and their proximity creates a constant potential for confusion and error. The movement between being and seeming leads to shifts in perception and understanding, where what appears may not always align with what truly is. This dynamic relationship is fundamental to human experience, as it opens up the possibility for mistakes and misjudgments. Quote 88. The way to being is unavoidable. The way to nothing is inaccessible. The way to seeming is always accessible and traveled, but it can be avoided. In this passage, Heidegger outlines the three paths humans encounter: the path to being, which is essential and inevitable; the path to nothing, which cannot be traveled but must be acknowledged; and the path to seeming, which is frequently followed but can be consciously avoided. Each of these paths represents a different relationship to reality, with seeming being the most dangerous because it can lead to deception and misinterpretation, yet it is also the most commonly taken path. Quote 89. Superior knowing, and all knowing is superiority, is granted only to one who has experienced the sweeping storm on the way of being, to whom the terror of the second way to the abyss of nothing has not remained foreign, and who has still taken over the third way, the way of seeming, as a constant urgency. Heidegger asserts that true wisdom comes from confronting all three paths: the path of being, the path of nothing, and the path of seeming. Those who have faced the challenges of these paths, including the terror of nothingness and the deception of seeming, possess a superior understanding. This comprehensive knowledge allows them to navigate the complexities of existence with greater insight, having experienced the full spectrum of reality. Quote 90. Being emerging appearance intrinsically inclines towards self-concealment. Heidegger explains that being, in its essence, tends toward concealment even as it emerges into appearance. This tension between revealing and hiding is fundamental to the nature of being. It suggests that what appears is always accompanied by a hidden dimension, making the process of understanding being an ongoing challenge, as it continuously oscillates between visibility and invisibility. Quote 91. Just as becoming is the seeming of being, seeming as appearing is the becoming of being. Heidegger suggests that the processes of becoming and seeming are interconnected with being. Becoming is how being appears to us as something that is in the process of emerging, while seeming, or appearance, is how being shows itself, making it seem as though it is constantly evolving. This relationship between becoming and seeming emphasizes the fluid and dynamic nature of being. Quote 92. The thinking and the Dasein of the Greeks struggles over a decision between the great powers of being and becoming, being and seeming. Heidegger reflects on how the ancient Greeks wrestled with understanding the distinctions between being and becoming, and being and seeming. These philosophical confrontations were foundational for their conception of reality and shaped their broader understanding of existence. The Greeks' intellectual efforts to resolve these tensions laid the groundwork for Western metaphysical thought. Quote 93. Thinking sets itself against being in such a way that being is represented to thinking, and consequently stands against thinking like an object. Here, Heidegger explains that thinking and being are placed in opposition, where thinking turns being into an object that stands before it. This opposition transforms being into something that can be analyzed, represented, and understood by the mind. This relationship between thinking and being is unique because it is different from the more passive encounters with becoming and seeming. Quote 94. It can be overcome only originally, that is, in such a way that its inceptive truth is shown its own limits and thereby founded anew. Heidegger suggests that the dominance of thinking over being can only be surpassed by returning to the original truths of being and showing where they limit or define themselves. In doing so, we would not discard the old understanding but renew it, building a fresh foundation for understanding being that incorporates its true essence. Quote 95. Being is not understood in an indeterminate way, but that the determinate understanding of being itself moves within a prior line of sight that has already been determined. Heidegger argues that our understanding of being is not random or vague, but is guided by a predetermined perspective. This prior framework shapes how we approach and understand being, though we may not always be aware of it. This structure informs all our encounters with being and conditions how we perceive it. Quote 96. The question of the relation between these two divisions must remain open for now. Heidegger acknowledges that the relationship between being and seeming, as well as being and becoming, is complex and unresolved. He leaves the question of how these distinctions relate to each other open for further exploration. This reflects the ongoing nature of philosophical inquiry into the nature of being, becoming, and seeming, which cannot be easily settled. Quote 97. What do logos and logos mean if they do not mean thinking? Logos means the word, discourse, and logos means to discourse, to talk. Heidegger examines the original meanings of the words logos and logos, showing that they do not originally mean thinking, but rather discourse or talking. This distinction is important because it emphasizes that logos is about gathering and bringing things together in speech, rather than purely intellectual activity. This broader sense of logos highlights the role of language in shaping and expressing thought. Quote 98. The Greeks did not yet necessarily think of discourse and saying in connection with logos. Heidegger points out that for the ancient Greeks, the concept of logos did not automatically imply discourse or language in the way it does for modern thinkers. Logos was more fundamentally about gathering and relating things rather than simply about verbal expression. This emphasizes how the meaning of logos evolved over time and how its original sense was more connected to relationships and order than to mere communication. Quote 99. We must know more, that is, we must know in a more rigorous and compelling way, than all earlier ages and upheavals before us. Heidegger emphasizes that in order to build a new historical foundation, we must have a deeper and more thorough understanding than past ages. This understanding should not be a mere repetition or imitation of what has come before, but a more rigorous knowledge that equips us to face new and unfamiliar challenges. Only by knowing the tradition in a profound way can we avoid falling into mere restoration and create something truly original. Quote 100. Human beings stand before logos as those who do not grasp logos, axonotoi. Human beings are such that they do not bring together, what then? Logos, that which is constantly together, gatheredness. Heidegger describes humans as those who fail to grasp logos, which he defines as the gatheredness of beings. Even though humans are surrounded by logos, they are unable to bring it together in their understanding. This inability to grasp logos means that humans often remain distant from the essential truth of being, unable to fully comprehend the unity that holds everything together. Quote 101. Logos is constant gathering, the gatheredness of beings that stands in itself, that is, being. Heidegger defines logos as the gathering of beings, which is the essence of being itself. This gatheredness is not something separate from being, but is a fundamental aspect of it. Logos holds things together, providing unity and coherence to existence, and this gathering is the core of what it means for something to be. Quote 102. Logos and physis are the same. Logos characterizes being in a new and yet old respect. That which is in being, which stands straight and prominently in itself, is gathered in itself and from itself. Heidegger asserts that logos and physis, nature or being, are essentially the same. Logos defines the nature of being as something that stands prominently and gathers itself from within. This unity between logos and being shows that the process of gathering and holding things together is intrinsic to the very nature of existence. Quote 103. The most beautiful world is like a dung heap, cast down in shambles. Heidegger uses this provocative statement from Heraclitus to illustrate the idea that even what is perceived as beautiful or orderly in the world is subject to chaos and conflict. The world's beauty is not static, but emerges from a constant process of being thrown into disorder and reconstituting itself. This tension between order and disorder is a central aspect of the world's being. Quote 104. If this unity of physis and logos is so originary, then the division must also be correspondingly originary. Heidegger argues that if the unity of logos, gathering, and physis, being, is so fundamental, then the division between them must also be equally fundamental. This division, which separates thinking from being, is not a later development, but an essential part of the original relationship between the two. Understanding this division requires us to look at it in the context of its originary connection. Quote 105. Thinking is the subjective, the subject. The relation of thinking to being is that of subject to object. Heidegger outlines the modern understanding of the relationship between thinking and being, where thinking is seen as subjective, and being as an object that thinking grasps. This division creates a distance between the two, positioning being as something external that thought must capture and define. This subject-object relationship is central to how modern philosophy understands the world. Quote 106. The disjunction between physis and logos, being and thinking, we are subject almost more immediately and obstinately to the danger of modern misinterpretation than in the interpretation of the unity of physis and logos. Heidegger warns that the modern misinterpretation of the relationship between being and thinking is particularly strong when it comes to understanding their separation. Modern thought tends to impose a simplistic subject-object schema on this disjunction, which obscures the deeper, more complex relationship that the Greeks understood between logos and physis. This misinterpretation makes it harder to grasp the true nature of their original connection and separation. Quote 107. Apprehension is the receptive bringing to a stand of the constant that shows itself in itself. Heidegger explains that apprehension, or knowen, is the act of receiving and bringing into clarity that which reveals itself. It is not passive, but involves actively holding steady what comes into appearance. This process is essential to understanding being, as it is through apprehension that the stable and constant nature of being is brought into view. Quote 108. Being holds sway, but because it holds sway, and insofar as it holds sway and appears, apprehension also necessarily occurs, along with appearance. Heidegger argues that being inherently brings about apprehension. As being reveals itself and comes into appearance, apprehension naturally arises alongside it. The act of apprehending is not separate from being, but is a part of its process of becoming visible and present in the world. Quote 109. The determination of the essence of the human being is never an answer, but is essentially a question. Heidegger stresses that the essence of what it means to be human is not something that can be definitively answered. Instead, it remains an open question that continually needs to be asked. This questioning is a fundamental part of human existence and history, and it is through questioning that humans engage with their own being. Quote 110. The question of who the human being is must always be posed in an essential connection with the question of how it stands with being. Heidegger emphasizes that the question of human identity cannot be separated from the question of being. To understand who humans are, we must consider their relationship to being, since human existence is deeply intertwined with the nature of being itself. This connection forms the basis for all philosophical inquiry into the human condition. Quote 111. Apprehension is not a way of behaving that the human being has as a property. To the contrary, apprehension is the happening that has the human being. Heidegger clarifies that apprehension is not merely a human faculty or ability, but is a fundamental process in which humans participate. Humans do not control apprehension. Instead, it is something that defines them. This happening shapes human existence, revealing that humans are bound by the process of apprehending being. Quote 112. Humanity first comes to itself and is a self only as questioning historical. Heidegger argues that humanity becomes fully itself through its historical process of questioning. It is not merely individual thought or action that defines human existence, but the continuous engagement with being and the historical unfolding of questioning. Through this process, humanity creates its identity and history. Quote 113. The saying does not say, thinking and being are the same, but instead says, belonging together reciprocally are apprehension and being. Heidegger reinterprets the famous Parmenidean statement to show that it does not equate thinking and being, but rather expresses their reciprocal belonging. Thinking, or apprehension, and being are not identical, but are deeply connected, each depending on the other for its full realization. This reciprocal relationship is central to understanding the nature of both. Quote 1 and 14. We must attempt to hear only what is said. Heidegger advises that to truly understand philosophical texts, especially those concerning being, we must listen carefully to what is actually being said, without imposing modern interpretations or preconceived notions. This pure form of listening requires setting aside biases and allowing the original meaning to reveal itself through attentive engagement. Quote 115. Manifold is the uncanny, yet nothing uncannier than man bestirs itself, rising up beyond him. Heidegger reflects on the opening lines of Sophocles' chorus from Antigone, emphasizing that humanity is the most uncanny of all things. The Greek word dinon, uncanny, encapsulates both the terrifying and the awe-inspiring nature of humans, who are capable of exceeding limits and confronting the overwhelming forces of being. This sets the stage for understanding humans as beings who both encounter and embody the uncanny. Quote 116. The human being is, in one word, to dinotaton, the uncanniest. Heidegger explains that the essence of humanity is defined by its uncanniness, a condition in which humans are both exposed to overwhelming forces and capable of confronting them through violence. This uncanniness is not just a characteristic, but the fundamental trait of human existence. It positions humanity at the intersection of the familiar and the unfamiliar, the homely and the unhomely. Quote 117. Everywhere trying out, underway, untried, with no way out, he comes to nothing. In this passage, Heidegger describes the human condition as one of constant exploration and striving, but without a final resolution. Humans are always testing boundaries, yet ultimately find themselves without a clear path forward, leading to the realization of their own finitude and mortality. This endless pursuit, combined with an inevitable encounter with nothingness, characterizes the uncanniness of human existence. Quote 118. Rising high in the sight of history, they also become a polis, without city in sight, lonesome, uncanny, with no way out amidst beings as a whole. Heidegger elaborates on the paradox of human existence. As humans rise to greatness in the realm of history and society, they simultaneously become isolated and without a true home, polis. This uncanniness is deepened by their estrangement from beings as a whole, as they find themselves in a constant state of displacement and homelessness, both physically and metaphysically. Quote 119. The uncanniest is what it is, because it harbors such an inception in which, from overabundance, everything breaks out at once into what is overwhelming and is to be surmounted. Here, Heidegger reveals that the uncanniest aspect of humanity lies in its ability to initiate overwhelming forces. Human existence is marked by an excess that overflows and must be confronted and overcome. This overwhelming force, which arises from the very nature of being, positions humanity in a constant struggle to master and transcend the forces that it sets in motion. Quote 120. How is humanity ever supposed to have invented that which pervades it in its sway, due to which humanity itself can be as humanity in the first place? Heidegger questions the notion that humans could have invented essential aspects of their existence, such as language, understanding, and creativity. These forces, which seem to belong to humanity, actually pre-exist and envelop humans, shaping their being. This paradox reflects the deeper truth that humans are not the originators of their own essence, but are shaped by the overwhelming powers that precede them. Quote 121. The violence doing of poetic saying, of thoughtful projection, of constructive building, of state-creating action, is not an application of faculties that the human being has, but is a disciplining and disposing of the violent forces by virtue of which beings disclose themselves as such. Heidegger emphasizes that human creativity, whether in poetry, thought, or building, is not simply a matter of exercising inherent faculties. Instead, it is an engagement with violent forces that reveal beings. This process of doing violence, in the sense of opening up being and making it manifest, is central to human historical existence. Humanity's role is not passive, but actively shapes and discloses the world through its actions. Quote 122. There is only one thing against which all violence doing directly shatters. That is death. Heidegger highlights that death is the ultimate limit that no human action, no matter how violent or creative, can overcome. Death represents the boundary beyond which no further mastery or subjugation is possible. It is the point where all human striving meets its end, revealing the inescapable finitude of human existence. Quote 123. The uncanniest is what it is, because, from the ground up, it deals with and conserves the familiar only in order to break out of it, and to let what overwhelms it break in. Heidegger describes the essence of the uncanniest, the human being, as being rooted in the tension between the familiar and the overwhelming. Humans conserve the familiar, the homely, yet they are constantly drawn to step beyond it, allowing the overwhelming and the uncanny to intrude. This breaking away from the familiar defines the human experience and opens them up to encounters with the unknown and the overpowering. Quote 124. Doing violence must shatter against the excessive violence of being, as long as being holds sway in its essence, as physis, as emerging sway. Heidegger suggests that human attempts to control or master being will always encounter resistance, as the excessive power of being, physis, remains beyond total human domination. As humans attempt to assert their will through violence and creative acts, they inevitably face the overwhelming force of being, which pushes back and limits their power. This shattering is part of the constant interplay between humans and the essence of being. Quote 125. Being itself throws humanity into the course of this tearing away, which forces humanity beyond itself as the one who moves out to being, in order to set being to work, and thus to hold open beings as a whole. Heidegger asserts that humans are not passive spectators of being, but are thrown into the unfolding of existence by being itself. This thrust compels humans to move beyond their own limitations, engaging with being to create, reveal, and hold open the space for beings to emerge. Humanity's role is to bring being into presence, actively participating in the process of making beings visible and real. Quote 126. For such a one, disaster is the deepest and broadest yes to the overwhelming. Heidegger reflects on the nature of the violence doer, the one who creates and brings forth new realities. For this individual, disaster is not something to be feared, but is instead a full acceptance of the overwhelming forces of being. In facing disaster, the violence doer affirms their role in confronting and revealing the overwhelming, recognizing that the shattering of their creations is part of their deeper engagement with the forces of existence. Quote 127. The authentic interpretation must show what does not stand there in the words, and which is nevertheless said. For this, the interpretation must necessarily use violence. Heidegger argues that to truly understand a text or a work of thought, one must go beyond the surface meaning of the words. Interpretation involves using a kind of intellectual violence to break through what is explicitly stated and uncover the deeper, unspoken truths. This act of interpretation is not gentle or passive. It requires forceful engagement to reveal what remains hidden within the text. Quote 128. Dike is the overwhelming fittingness. Techne is the violence doing of knowing. The reciprocal relation between them is the happening of uncanniness. Heidegger describes the relationship between Dike, fittingness or justice, and techne, the knowledge-driven creation of humans, as one of tension and interplay. Dike represents the natural order and balance, while techne involves human attempts to shape and control the world. The interaction between these forces creates uncanniness, as humans constantly navigate between fitting into the natural order and asserting their own creative will. Quote 129. Apprehension can become this passage only if it is fundamentally a decision for being against nothing, and thus a confrontation with seeming. Heidegger suggests that true apprehension, or understanding, is not a passive process, but involves a decisive choice between being and nothing. This confrontation with seeming, the illusion or appearance of reality, requires humans to actively choose to engage with what is real and reject what is false. This decision is a fundamental part of how humans engage with the world and make sense of their existence. Quote 130. Legen means to produce the unconcealed, as such, beings in their unconcealment. Heidegger explains that legein, the Greek term for gathering or saying, involves the act of revealing beings as they truly are. This process of bringing beings into unconcealment is central to the nature of language and understanding. Through legen, humans gather and reveal the truth of beings, participating in the unfolding of being itself. Quote 131. Logos is an urgency and in itself needs to use violence in order to fend off glibness and dispersion. Heidegger emphasizes that logos, gathering or reason, is not a passive process, but one that requires force to maintain its integrity. The act of gathering truth requires resisting superficiality and distraction. Violence, in this context, refers to the active effort needed to preserve the depth and seriousness of logos against the forces that would dilute it. Quote 132. To be human means to gather and apprehend the being of beings, to take over the knowing setting into work of appearance, and thus to govern unconcealment, to preserve it against concealment and covering up. Heidegger defines humanity's essence as the ability to gather and comprehend being. Humans are tasked with the responsibility of revealing truth and ensuring that it remains unconcealed. This involves actively engaging with and working through appearances to ensure that what is revealed stays visible and is not hidden again by falsehood or neglect. Quote 133. We grasp the inception in a freely constructed formula that also summarizes our interpretation up to now. Phusis, thous logos, anthropon ekon. Being, the overwhelming appearing, necessitates the gathering that pervades and grounds being human. Heidegger offers a new understanding of the relationship between phusis, nature or being, and logos. Being is not just something that happens. It requires human intervention through logos, the gathering that helps being manifest and be understood. This interpretation highlights the role of humans in actively grounding and shaping their understanding of existence. Quote 134. Never to have stepped into Dasein triumphs over the gatheredness of beings as a whole. Heidegger reflects on a passage from Sophocles' Oedipus at Colonus to express the notion that not being born, or not entering into existence, Dasein, surpasses all experience and involvement in being. This highlights the tragic nature of human existence, as entering Dasein inevitably leads to struggles with being, and the overwhelming forces that shape reality. Quote 135. Not being here is the ultimate victory over being. Dasein is the constant urgency of defeat and of the renewed resurgence of the act of violence against being. Heidegger describes human existence as a continuous struggle with being, where the ultimate victory would be not to exist at all. Human life is marked by repeated attempts to assert itself against the overwhelming force of being, and this constant tension defines the nature of Dasein. Despite these struggles, Dasein persists, constantly grappling with its role in the world. Quote 136. The slow ending of this history, in whose midst we have long been standing, is the dominance of thinking as ratio, as both understanding and reason, over the being of beings. Heidegger discusses how modern history has been dominated by a rationalist approach, where reason and understanding have taken precedence over the deeper essence of being. This dominance of ratio reflects a shift away from the original, more profound Greek understanding of logos and physis, resulting in a narrowing of human thought and experience. Quote 137. What remains decisive is not the fact in itself that physis was characterized as idea, but that the idea rises up as the sole and definitive interpretation of being. Heidegger explains that the interpretation of being as idea, though rooted in Greek thought, becomes problematic when it is elevated as the only valid understanding. This shift diminishes the broader, more dynamic concept of being as physis, emerging sway, and limits human engagement with the full scope of existence by reducing it to mere appearances or forms. Quote 138. In the interpretation of being as idea, not only is an essential consequence falsified into the essence itself, but this falsification is misinterpreted yet again, and this, too, happens in the course of Greek experience and interpretation. Heidegger criticizes the way that the concept of idea, derived from the Greek experience of being, eventually becomes misinterpreted as the essence of being itself. This misunderstanding leads to a distortion of the original insights of Greek philosophy, which recognized the complexity and dynamism of being beyond mere appearances. Quote 139. The transformation of being from physis to idea itself brings about one of the essential forms of movement within the history of the West, not just the history of Western art. Heidegger highlights that the shift from understanding being as physis, emergent nature, to idea, form, or concept is a significant development in the history of Western thought. This transformation marks not just a change in philosophical ideas, but also a broader shift that affects all aspects of Western history and culture, including art. It signals a new way of thinking about existence, where the emphasis moves from the dynamic process of becoming to fixed ideal forms. Quote 140. What has been said can be said again and passed on. The truth that is preserved in this saying spreads in such a way that the being that was originally opened up in gathering is not itself properly experienced in each particular case. Heidegger suggests that when truth is passed on through language, it often loses its original meaning and depth. What was once a direct experience of truth becomes diluted as it is repeated and shared, leading to a situation where people encounter only a shallow version of the original insight. This loss of immediacy in experiencing truth is a key concern for Heidegger, who sees it as a consequence of how language evolves and spreads. Quote 141. Truth, which was originally as unconcealment, a happening of the beings themselves that held sway, and was governed by means of gathering, now becomes a property of logos. Heidegger explains that the original understanding of truth as aletheia, unconcealment, has been replaced by a more superficial notion of truth as a property of language or assertion, logos. In this transformation, truth is no longer about the direct revealing of beings, but instead becomes something that can be judged as correct or incorrect based on how statements align with facts. This shift changes the essence of truth and distances it from its original, more dynamic meaning. Quote 142. Logos becomes the assertion, the locus of truth as correctness, the origin of the categories, the basic principle that determines the possibilities of being. Here, Heidegger describes how logos, originally the act of gathering and revealing truth, becomes reduced to mere assertions that determine correctness. This shift leads to the development of categories and logical systems that define the possibilities of being. This change marks a significant departure from the original, more profound role of logos in shaping human understanding of existence, reducing it to a tool for classification and judgment. Quote 143. The struggle for the unconcealment of beings which in itself already happens only as constant antagonism, is always at the same time the strife against concealment, covering up against seeming. Heidegger emphasizes that the process of revealing truth is inherently a struggle, one that constantly fights against forces of concealment and distortion. Truth, or aletheia, is not something that is easily attained. It requires an active confrontation with forces that hide or obscure the true nature of beings. This ongoing struggle is fundamental to the human experience of reality. Quote 144. Seeming becomes mere logical incorrectness, falsehood. Only on this basis can we completely gauge what the opposition of thinking to being means. Thinking extends its dominance over being and, at the same time, over what is opposed to being. Heidegger explains that as the concept of seeming becomes equated with falsehood or incorrectness, thinking begins to dominate both being and its opposite. This shift reflects a broader tendency in Western philosophy to prioritize logical correctness and judgment over a more nuanced understanding of existence. As thinking asserts its control over what is considered true or false, it also begins to shape the very nature of being. Quote 145. What always already lies at hand before us is, from the point of view of physis, of emergence, what is proteron, the earlier, the a priori. Heidegger reflects on how the emergence of beings, physis, is understood as something that has always been present, something a priori. From the perspective of physis, the process of coming into being is seen as something that precedes human understanding or judgment. This notion contrasts with later philosophical developments that prioritize logical structures and categories over the more primordial experience of being. Quote 146. The collapse of unconcealment, as we briefly call this happening, does not originate from a mere deficiency, from an inability to sustain any longer that which, with this essence, was given to historical humanity to preserve. Heidegger argues that the loss of the original experience of unconcealment, truth as aletheia, is not simply due to a failure of human effort. Instead, it is a consequence of the greatness and complexity of the original inception of truth. This collapse is a natural part of the historical unfolding of being, and it requires thoughtful retrieval and reinterpretation rather than simplistic blame or regret. Quote 147. Being is grounded in thinking. It is surmounted by the ought. Heidegger explains that being is rooted in thinking, which provides a foundation for understanding it. However, being is surpassed by the ought, which represents what should be, but is not yet realized. The ought exceeds being, suggesting that ethical or ideal values transcend mere existence, pushing beyond the limitations of what currently is. Quote 148. The highest idea is the archetype of the prototypes. Heidegger is referencing Plato's idea of the agathon, or the good, which is considered the highest form or archetype. This highest idea not only serves as the model for all other ideas, but also grants being its potency. It represents an ideal standard beyond the limitations of material existence, which all other forms strive to emulate. Quote 149. The ought must assert its claims. It must attempt to ground itself in itself. Heidegger discusses the role of the ought in modern thought, where values must justify themselves. The ought, or moral imperative, cannot rely on external factors to legitimize its existence. Instead, it must find its justification within its own structure. This shift leads to the idea that values become self-grounding, standing apart from the factual reality of beings. Quote 150. Values provide the measure for all domains of beings, that is, of what is present at hand. History is nothing but the actualization of values. Heidegger emphasizes that in modern thought, values dictate how beings are understood and engaged with. History itself becomes a process through which these values are realized or enacted. This perspective views history as a stage for the unfolding of value systems, shaping human actions and the world according to these standards. Quote 151. The transformation of physis and logos, and thus the transformation in their relation to each other, is a fall away from the inceptive inception. Heidegger argues that the original Greek understanding of physis, nature, and logos, gathering or reason, has been transformed, resulting in a departure from their original meanings. This shift marks a decline from the profound inception of Western philosophy, where the deep unity of being and logos was understood, to a more superficial interpretation that fails to capture the essence of existence. Quote 152. Becoming, seeming, thinking, the ought, is it nothing? By no means. Heidegger challenges the dismissal of these concepts as mere illusions or falsehoods. Each of these, becoming, seeming, thinking, and the ought, plays a critical role in shaping the nature of being. They are not empty or meaningless, but are integral to understanding existence and the complexities of human experience. Quote 153. Being must therefore be experienced anew, from the bottom up, and in the full breadth of its possible essence. Heidegger calls for a radical rethinking of being, urging that it be approached from a fresh perspective that takes into account its full complexity. This new understanding must break away from the traditional, limited view of being and explore its essence in a way that addresses all its potential meanings and dimensions, including those previously ignored. Quote 154. Humanity is the here that is open in itself. Beings stand within this here and are set to work in it. Heidegger describes humanity as the site where being is revealed and engaged. Humans are the here in which beings manifest themselves and are brought into presence. This openness allows humans to interact with and shape the world, making them central to the unfolding of being. Introduction to Metaphysics by Martin Heidegger ultimately exposes the limitations of conventional metaphysical frameworks, emphasizing that a genuine understanding of being requires moving beyond the constraints of traditional philosophy. Heidegger explores how Western thought has fragmented being, relegating it to narrow scientific interpretations that lack true spiritual engagement. He calls for a shift towards a reflective mode of questioning that connects historical experience with the openness of physis, the Greek vision of being as a dynamic, revealing force. By reclaiming this foundational perspective, Heidegger challenges readers to re-envision their relationship with existence, encouraging an authentic spiritual awakening within the context of modernity's existential challenges.
Curious to dive into the mind of Martin Heidegger? With StudyLab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of Introduction to Metaphysics in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.